where we're at, starting with 1443, I believe it is. Today's title of today's lesson is Jesus Stands Trial. That's the title and subject of today's lesson. You know, I believe we've all heard the phrase, innocent until proven guilty. Everybody heard that?
Yes, ma'am.
But what about the innocent who are proven guilty? You ever thought of it? What about the innocent who are proven guilty? That'd be hard to take, wouldn't it? You know, that's quite a case of basically unjustly accused and unfairly tried. In many cases, it is mistaken information. What feelings do these words stir up in you? Think about those words. What if you were innocent and proven guilty? There has. It's not an isolated instance. But think about what feelings this stirs up in you. The thought that you could especially be considered, especially as you consider the possibility that it could happen to you. We don't think things like that can happen to us. You know, it kind of puts me in mind of a lot of times the way people are today with a lot of other things. They don't think it can happen to them. But it can. As I said, this is not an isolated event. It's happened many times. Take, for instance, since its founding in 1992, a nonprofit organization called the Innocence Project has been responsible for exonerating hundreds of people through DNA testing. Most of these people had been tried and sentenced by mistake because they had been falsely accused. You know, such was a case as far back as Bible days, the New Testament time, with Jesus being tried and convicted without due process on the basis of false accusations. So it even happened way back when, you might say. His own people wanted him to be convicted and handed him over to be killed. If you want to, you can look with me to Acts 3:13. It tells us there, it says, the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob, the God of our fathers, hath glorified his Son Jesus, whom you delivered up, and denied him in the presence of Pilate when he was determined to let him go. You know, we see here that Jesus was basically betrayed by one of his disciples, deserted by the rest, and tried before the Roman government, is what we'll see throughout this lesson today. Jesus faced rejection basically beyond anything we can imagine. Yet his attitude and behavior in these darkest hours of life serve as our best example for when we face such dark times in our own lives. All you have to do is go back to the story of his trial, his arrest, and you can learn from how his attitude was about the whole situation. You know, since Jesus did nothing but good, it may seem surprising to us that he was arrested and put to death. However, Jesus wasn't surprised. By these events, he wasn't surprised by any of these events. He knew the sinfulness of human hearts, and he also knew the Father's plan required his death and resurrection. You know, through the study of Mark, we are reminded that the events of our lives don't surprise God either. We can therefore trust him to help us respond in love when we are confronted by the challenges we face also. You know, as we begin our study of Jesus' trial, we start with part 1, which is titled Betrayed and Arrested. That will be found in Mark 14, verses 43 through 47. And immediately while he yet spoke, came Judas, one of the 12, and with him a great multitude with swords and staffs, from which the chief priest and the scribes and the elders. And he that betrayeth him had given them a sign, saying, Whomever I shall kiss, that same is he. Take him and lead him away safely. And as soon as he had come, he went straightway to him and said, Master, Master, and kissed him. And they laid their hands on him and took him. And one of those who stood by drew a sword and smote a servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. You know, we look here and it talks about betrayal, basically. What comes to mind when you think of betrayal? Anybody? What comes to your mind when you think of betrayal?
Dishonest.
What was that?
Dishonest.
Dishonest, Susie says. You know, to betray basically means to expose. For instance, to expose one's country, a group, or a person to danger by treacherously giving information to an enemy is the main definition of betrayal. That's true. A lot of times it can be a close person, someone you would never think would betray you.
Well, you confine them to something and then they tell us or something like that.
Okay, that's good. You know, like I said, this to betray, if you look at one of the main definitions here, means to take one's country, a group, a person, or whatever it might be, and to give them over to someone else, basically, to betray them. You know, this is what Christ experienced, betrayal. One of the darkest moments in all of history is the betrayal of Jesus by one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot. The Bible story of Judas betraying Jesus is found in all four Gospels and could be seen as one of the most significant events of disloyalty throughout history, I would say. Verses 44 and 45, we see that Judas called Jesus Rabbi in some of the versions, and some say Master, a title of great honor. He greeted Jesus with a kiss, which was an act which both Paul and Peter in Romans 16:16 and 1 Peter 5 and 14 speak of. This was a deceitful act by Judas, however. Very deceitful act. You know, there are several explanations as to why Judas betrayed Jesus that vary among the Gospels, the Gospel accounts, and different commentaries. But if you think about it, the fact remains that Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, as Matthew 26 and 15 tells us. Therefore, the betrayal of Jesus was for Judas's own benefit. Much like the betrayal of people today. It's for somebody else's own benefit. The fact that Jesus knew that Jesus knew that Judas would betray him does not in any way remove the responsibility from Judas, however. He betrayed Jesus because he chose to. The same is true for any who do not serve Christ. It is by choice, our choice. You know, while people continue to make excuses for Judas and themselves, the fact is there are no excuses. Or better translated, there are no legitimate excuses. I say that because of Romans 1:19 and 20, which tells us, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath shown it unto them. For from the creation of the world the invisible things of him are clearly seen, being understood through the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. We have no excuse. It is before us. You know, but verse 46 speaks of the group involved in the arrest here. It says, and they, speaking basically of the religious leaders who probably brought in the guards possibly here and laid their hands on him and took him. As we can see from John 10:17 and 18, this was possible only because he, speaking of Christ himself, allowed it. It wasn't that he was without power. In fact, John 10:17 and 18 reads, therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life that I might take it again. No man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This commandment have I received from my Father. So if we look at these two verses here, it says, I laid down my life. It doesn't say anything about they took it. And if you look then to verse 18 here in John 10:17 and 18, it again confirms verse 17, which says, no man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. So let's look, as we look at that, let's move now to verse 47 here in Mark 14. It shows here Peter's impulsiveness, as we see, and one of them, and if we go over to John 18 and 10, it clears up who the one was, and it was Simon Peter. He drew a sword and cut off a servant's ear. also by his action demonstrated an unwise zeal, you might say, as Romans 10:2 reads, "For I bear them record that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge." He didn't have the knowledge or the understanding that what was going on was the plan of God. So he basically had an unwise zeal for Christ. You know, according to knowledge, however, Jesus willingly accepted his arrest as part of God's redemptive plan because he was knowledgeable of what was going on. In fact, John 18:11 reads, "Then Jesus said unto Peter, Put up thy sword into thy sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it?" As we move on now to Mark 14, verses 48 through 52, if you'd like to read along there.
I think that would be the difference between walking in the flesh and walking in the spirit.
Jan says she believed that would be the difference between walking in the flesh and walking in the spirit. That's a good point. Thank you. And I would agree with that. So then Jesus answered and said unto them, Have you come out as against a thief with swords and with staffs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you took me not, but the scripture must be fulfilled. And they all forsook him and fled. And there followed him a certain young man having a linen cloth cast about his naked body, and the young men laid hold on him. And he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. You know, while Jesus held all authority, as is declared throughout the scriptures, he allowed himself to be taken by force in Gethsemane. Jesus was never stripped of his authority. He gave his life willingly, as we noted earlier in John 10:17 and 18. You know, as we look here at verses 48 and 49, we see it says, Are you come out against me as a thief with swords and with staffs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you took me not then, he says. You know, why come now? Christ here basically argues with them that had seized him and shows them the absurdity of their proceedings, basically, against him. As he said to them in verse 48 in the NIV, Am I leading a rebellion that you come out against me with swords and clubs to capture me? He wasn't leading a rebellion. You know, they came as against a thief, whereas he was innocent of any crime. He had taught daily in the temple, as he said. Had he any wicked design about him, it would have at some time or another had been discovered at that point. So why did they take him at that point? Why did they wait? You know, it may be that these who had seized him had heard his sermons in the temple, as verse 49 reads, I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you took me not. Why now? Why at night, despite the many times that you could have arrested me while I was teaching publicly? It is possible they feared the crowd, plus the fact that it just wasn't time. Verse 50 says, And they all forsook him and fled. Just hours earlier, his disciples had vowed never to desert Jesus. Now they have all fled. They were very confident that they should adhere to him. But the truth of the matter is that even good men and women don't know what they'll do till they are tried. They said they'd never forsake him, that they'd stand by him basically. But when the time came, they all fled. And we really can't point the finger, because if we haven't been there, we don't know what we would do. Not a one of them stood with him. Instead, it was fulfilled what Jesus said in Mark 14 and 27. All you shall be offended because of me this night, for it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. You know, as we look at verses 51 and 52, we see that Jesus is also forsaken by a young follower who in the confusion fled them naked, it tells us. Tradition says that this young man may have been John Mark, the writer of this gospel, as the incident is not mentioned in any of the other accounts. Maybe this was Mark's humble way of saying, I was there. You know, whoever this young man was, it remains that he also forsook Christ, fleeing in haste, leaving him to stand alone. Yet as John 16:32 shows, Christ wasn't really alone. How do you think you would respond if you faced apprehension by authorities because of your faith? Something to think about, because in the times and the days we're living in, you never know, you might live to see that time. Part 2 of our lesson in Mark comes from Mark 14:53 through 64. Jesus before the high priest, attacked by false testimony. We're going to read Mark 14:53 through 64. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. And Peter followed him afar off, even into the palace of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. And the chief priest and all of the council sought for witness against Jesus to put him to death, and found none. For many more bore false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. And there arose certain ones who bore false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither did their witness agree together. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But he held his peace and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes and said, Why need we any further witnesses? Ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. You know, we see here in these verses Jesus before the Sanhedrin. There was just no way around it. The Jewish leaders, as we see here, were determined to have Jesus put to death. Yet they lacked the power to do so, neither did they have evidence needed to request his death. Instead, they enlisted witnesses basically to lie about what Jesus had said, but the testimonies of the witnesses didn't line up with each other. You know, not to be deterred, they even used Jesus' own true statement that he is indeed the Messiah against him. They used the truth basically against him to condemn him to death. As verse 53 says, that Jesus was led to the high priest's home where the high priest and teachers and the religious law had gathered. You know, the high priest was Caiaphas here. This trial by the high council had 2 phases, if you look at it. A group met at night, as John 18:12 through 24 speaks of, and then the full high council met at daybreak, as we would see if we go over to Luke 22:66 through 71. You know, they tried Jesus for religious offenses, basically, such as calling himself the Son of God, which according to law was blasphemy. But he told the truth because he was. So therefore it wasn't blasphemy. The trial was fixed, you might say. These religious leaders had already decided to kill Jesus, if we look over to Luke 22:2. It says, And the chief priest and the scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. So they were determined to have him killed, to put him to death. They already had their plan. You know, Mark did not record the preliminary trial before Annas, who was the real power behind the high priest's office, recorded in John 18:12-13 and 18:19-23, nor did he record the second trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, the official daylight trial recorded in Luke 22:66 through 71, as I just spoke of. You know, there are similarities between the trials because the same people were involved. There were actually 3 phases of Jesus' trial before the Jewish authorities and the 3 phases of his trial before the Roman authorities, and they should not basically be confused. Upon his arrest, Jesus was first taken to Annas, then to an illegal night court of the Sanhedrin, which Mark will describe a little later, then to an official daylight trial of the Sanhedrin, and then to Pilate, who sent Jesus to Herod, who sent Jesus back to Pilate, where he then went to the cross. Boy, what an arrest and trial. That'd almost confuse you just back and forth where they took him, just trying to get a conviction. Verse 54 shows Peter entering the palace of the high priest, sitting with the servants and warming himself, it tells us, at the fire. This was just one step in Peter's fall, you might say, as he enters to sit with such evil associations, therefore entering himself basically into temptation, as we'll later see in verse 7. Rome did not allow the Sanhedrin to carry out the death penalty. Therefore, the Jewish court needed to first condemn him, then hand him over to the Romans. And so, therefore, the plot is laid out and begins here. Since they didn't have the power to do what they wanted to, the Jewish people, they had to find a way around things. They had to plot, you might say. But as Deuteronomy so the plot is laid out and begins, at the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death, but at the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death. So they had not found any witnesses that were telling the same story. So they couldn't put him to death at this time, not legally. But this comes from Deuteronomy 17:6, what I just read. And it shows that death penalty required the testimony of at least 2 witnesses, and they couldn't get 2 witnesses to cooperate. The Romans basically controlled Israel, but the Jews were given some authority over religious and minor civil disputes, is basically where the problem was here. They didn't control the whole picture, just a part of it. The Jewish ruling body, the High Council, was made up of 71 of Israel's religious leaders. That should have been a good thing. Wow. 71 religious leaders. Things ought to go good for God or for Christ. You would think. But just because they were religious leaders doesn't mean they were following Christ. It would stand to reason that these men would be just, you would think. Instead, they showed great injustice in the trial of Jesus, even to the point of making up lies against him. Such another account of such plotting is found over in Daniel 6 and 4. And it tells us there, it says, then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no occasion nor fault, inasmuch as he was faithful. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. So we see even another occasion of where this happened to someone. They tried to find occasion and couldn't. A word to those who face such injustice is also found over in 1 Peter 3:16 and 18. So if we find ourselves in this situation, go to 1 Peter 3:16 and 18. It says, have a good conscience that whereas they speak evil of you as of evildoers, they who falsely accuse may be ashamed by your good manner of life in Christ. For it is better if the will of God be so, that you suffer well-doing than for evil-doing. For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. So if you ever have to face that and you need encouragement, go to that scripture. As we look here to verses 57 and 58, it brings about the testimony of false witness. In verse 57 it says, and there arose certain. This speaks of 2 men as given in Matthew 26:59 and 60, which reads, says, now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. At the last came 2 false witnesses. So basically, they have their 2 false witnesses. They needed 2 witnesses, remember. I don't guess they have to tell anybody they're false witnesses. But as we see here, it tells us in verse 57, and bear false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. So they're saying he said one thing when he didn't. The truth here is basically misunderstood. The statement that the false witnesses finally agreed to use as an accusation twisted Jesus' actual words. Jesus did not say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands. He said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. John 2:19. You know, Jesus wasn't talking about Herod's temple, but about his own body. It says in verse 59, but neither so did their witness agree together. So they're still back where they were. They're still meeting their witnesses, and they still haven't been able to convict. You know, time and time again, those testifying leveled false accusations that contradicted each other. They kept going and kept going and kept going. They were so intent on the death of Christ that they'd do anything. You know, as a quote from Sir Walter Scott goes, oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And that's what we see here, a tangled web, basically, as they practice to deceive for what they want. You know, for lies breed more lies. With lies you go far sometimes, but not back again. Because most of the time you can't come back to what you first said to start with, because you don't really remember all of it to the exact word. And so you might go a long ways, but you'll never make it back to where you started, because you're probably going to be forgot half of what you said by the time you get there. Therefore, lies never give the same story, which was the case here, but they contradict each other many times. It says, but not even then did their testimony agree in verse 9. You know, though it was a false case, the accusers of Jesus could not put together a good case. The false witnesses kept disagreeing with one another. It was harder to agree on a consistent lie than to tell the simple truth, basically, that they wanted to lie. You know, as we move to verses 60 through 64, Christ is examined by the high priest, basically, here. It says, and the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him, saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus. You know, this basically is suggesting that the high priest arose from his seat and advanced into maybe this semicircle of the council towards Jesus, in the action of an irritated, baffled man, basically what it seems to be here. You know, it was tacit confession that Christ had been proved innocent up to this point. The high priest would not have needed to draw something out of the accused one if there had been sufficient material against him elsewhere. But they couldn't find that, so they had to try and get him to say the wrong thing. The trial had been a dreadful failure, basically, up to this point, and he knew it, and was red with rage, basically, this fellow that had to stand up. Now he attempts to basically bully the prisoner that he may extract some declaration from him which may save all further trouble of witnesses and end the matter. But it says here that Jesus kept silent and answered nothing. Sometimes it pays to be silent. Jesus could have mounted a magnificent defense here, calling forth all of the various witnesses to his deity, power, and character. The people he taught, the people he healed, the dead risen, the blind who see, even the demons themselves testified to his deity. So he had plenty that could have witnessed for him. But Jesus opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before the shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth, as Isaiah 53 would put it. You know, after all, they had no desire for the truth. So what good would it have done anyways? They didn't want to hear the truth. In their heart, they probably knew the truth. You know, he said there, he says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power. Jesus, when asked under formal oath to incriminate himself, essentially said, you now stand in judgment of me, but I will be the ultimate judge, is basically what he's going to say here, and not really saying any word. You say I am, is what he told him. These words would have given any wise judge, I think, a pause, but did not slow down this accuser, or any of his accusers at this time. You know, to the first question, Jesus made no reply because it was based on confusing and erroneous evidence, you might say. Not answering was wiser than trying to clarify the fabricated accusations at this time, which many times is true. But if Jesus had refused to answer the second question, it could have been taken as a denial of his mission. Therefore, he answered their second question. Instead, his answer predicted a power role reversal, as I said. Sitting at God's right hand in the place of power, he would come to judge his accusers one day instead of them judging him. And they would have to answer his question. As spoken of in Psalm 110 and 1 and Revelation 20:11-13. Because it says, it speaks there in Revelation 20:11, says, and I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and the death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every man according to their works. So the role here would be reversed one day. He would be the judge. They would be the accused. You know, here we basically see that Jesus was on trial. He seemed to lose. When you listen to all of this, it seems like he's losing the case. But he really won, as we just stated from that verse there in Revelation. His conduct at his trial showed his innocence and was all part of the plan of redemption, which we must receive as God's gift. In a real sense, it wasn't Jesus on trial at all here. It was more accurate to say that the religious leaders were on trial. They seemed to win, but they really lost. In fact, we all are on trial before Jesus and will be held to account for what we do to him one day, as I just read there. As we move on now and we look at Mark 14:63 through 65, again it told us there in verse 63, then the high priest tore his clothes and said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And then some began to spit on him, and to blindfold him, and to beat him, and to say to him, prophesy. And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. You know, the high priest tore his clothes. You heard the blasphemy, they said. First, they reacted with self-righteousness, melodramatic horror, and then abuse and brutality as they began to slap him, it says here, and to beat him. And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. You know, as terrible as the judgment of the religious leaders against Jesus was, at least it had a reason: envy and fear of Jesus. These officers, taking a bizarre pleasure in torturing Jesus, didn't even have a reason. They just took pleasure in torturing somebody. They did it only because of what others, mainly the religious leaders, had said about Jesus, not anything he had done to them. Then some of them spit on him and blindfolded him and beat him, and said, you know, understanding that Jesus endured such pain and humiliation should cause us to respond in three ways. As Charles Spurgeon would be quoted, he says, firstly, greatly bear pain and humiliation for the sake of Jesus ourselves. How ready should we be to bear slander or to hear slander and ridicule for Jesus' sake? Do not get into a huff and think it a strange thing that people should mock you. Who are you, dear sir? Who are you? What can you be if compared with Christ? If they spat on him, why should they not spit upon you? If they buffeted him, why should they not buffet you? Shall your master have all the rough of it? Shall he have all the bitter and you all the sweet? A pretty soldier you to demand better fare than your captain. And that was the first quote and one of the first things of the three that we should do. And secondly, he said we should be more diligent to praise Jesus. How earnestly next ought we to honor our dear Lord? If men were so eager to put him to shame, let us be 10 times more earnest to bring him glory. Is there anything we can do today by which he may be honored? Let us set about it. Can we make any sacrifice? Can we perform any difficult task which would glorify him? Let us not deliberate, but at once do it with our might. Let us be inventive in modes of glorifying him, even as his adversaries were ingenious in the methods of his shame. And thirdly, we should have more assurance of confidence in receiving the finished work of Jesus for our redemption. Surely I know that he who suffered this, since he was verily the Son of the Blessed, must have ability to save us. Such griefs must be a full atonement for our transgressions. Glory be to God. That spittle on his countenance means a clear, bright face for me. Those false accusations on his character mean no condemnation for me. And those are just 3 reasons why we should all the more serve and praise our Lord. You know, as we look at verse 64 and 65, it shows Christ's divinity is challenged as he is spit upon, mocked, and smited, and told to prophesy. Basically, when they told him to prophesy, this showed a spiritual abuse added to the physical abuse. Kind of a mocking. Well, if you're so-and-so, then just prophesy, why don't you? Oh, the things that Christ endured for us is all we can say. They were all unimaginable. None could even fathom what he endured on the way to the cross, much less on the cross. We much of the time think about the cross and what he endured there. But think about what he endured on the way there. As Isaiah 52 and 14 says, some 800 years earlier had prophesied his visage was so marred more than any man. Christ has so far been betrayed by Judas, taken by force, attacked by false testimony, and now as we move on, he is denied by Peter. Wow. And we think we've got it right. Now, as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with Jesus of Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you are saying." And he went out of the porch, and a rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him again, and began to say to those who stood by, "This is the one of them." But he denied it again. And a little later, those who stood by said to Peter again, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it." Then he began to curse and swear, I do not know this man of whom you speak." A second time the rooster crowed. Then Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And when he thought about it, he wept. So we see now, after all that he's already gone through, Peter denies him. You know, as we look at this, as Mark concludes the story of Peter's denial in Mark 14:66 through 72, he does it as a flashback here. This didn't happen as Jesus was beaten, but as he was on trial. Peter's first problem was that he followed him at a distance. We don't need to follow Christ at a distance. When we distance ourselves from Jesus, it is hard to make a proper stand for him at that critical time. Next, Peter sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire, as we saw in Mark 14:54. Peter found fellowship and warmth in the company of the ungodly, having forsaken the fellowship of the fleeing disciples. Peter wanted to seem just one of this crowd, not a follower of Jesus at this time. And thirdly, the officers of Mark 14:65 who struck Jesus are the same people as the servants of Mark 14:54, because the same ancient Greek word is used of both groups. Peter sat and associated himself with the same men who beat Jesus. And they beat him just because someone else told them that Jesus was a wicked man. And that's where Peter went wrong. Peter went wrong. You know, he says, "I neither know nor understand what you are saying." You know, this is basically probably a hostile man of authority that interrogated Jesus. Peter did not face this kind of interrogation. He didn't face the interrogation that Christ did. He only faced a servant girl. But she was enough to make Peter deny Jesus. You know, tells us a lot about how easy, if we don't stay close to Christ, we can betray him. We can do the wrong thing.
I think it's amazing too that God had proved that he wasn't serving God when he started swearing,
Yes.
cussing. And so it makes me always think that when a child of God can just start cussing because they're angry or whatever reason, it makes you know how far away that person is from God at the moment. That they're not either in prayer or they're not in the Word where he needs to be, or whatever reason, they're not walking with God through in the flesh. And because if Peter can prove that he's not walking with God by swearing, it's scary that is a line that a child of God is on, the same exact spot that he is in at that moment. It's a scary spot to be in.
You know, he said here, he says, "I neither know nor understand." Peter denied the charge using the form common in rabbinical law for a formal legal denial, basically. Yet all this evil sprung from the fear of man. All of this sprung from the fear of man. How many denials of Christ and his truth have sprung since this time? From the same cause. You know, thinking it might help distance himself from association with Jesus, Peter began, like she said here, cuss and swear. When we hear that kind of language, we assume the person is not a follower or not following close to Christ, as Jan was talking about here. And when he thought about it, he wept. Peter finally called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him. But he remembered too late. He had already sinned. Then all Peter could do was weep bitterly. But he will be restored. You know, there is significant contrast between Judas and Peter, however. Both of them denied Jesus in one way or another. But one was restored and the other was not. Restoring Peter was important to Jesus after his resurrection. Jesus had a private meeting with Peter and a public restoration with Peter, as we see in Luke 24:34 and John 21. Judas ended up as an apostate, one who forsakes his religion. And that's how he ended up. And Peter was a backslider who suffered spiritual decline from an experience he once enjoyed. So there's a big difference there in the two. As we look back to part 3 of our lesson and begin to close out here. And it speaks of Jesus going before Pilate. In Mark 15, 1 through 5 is where we start here. I'm going to read this from the New Living Translation. It says, very early in the morning, the leading priests, other leaders, and teachers of the religious law, the entire high council, met to discuss their next step. They bound Jesus and took him to Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "Yes, it is, as you say." Then the leading priest accused him of many crimes, and Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to say something about all these charges against you?" But Jesus said nothing, much to Pilate's surprise. Now it was the governor's custom to release the prisoners each year at Passover time, anyone the people requested. I'm going to go on to verse 15. One of the prisoners at that time was Barabbas, convicted along with others for murder during the insurrection. The mob began to crowd in toward Pilate, asking him to release a prisoner as usual. "Should I give you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked, for he realized by now that the leading priest had arrested Jesus out of envy. But at this point, the leading priest stirred up the mob to demand the release of Barabbas instead of Jesus. "But if I release Barabbas," Pilate asked him, "what should I do with this man you call the king of Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why?" Pilate demanded. "What crime has he committed?" But the crowd only roared the louder, "Crucify him." So Pilate, anxiously to please the crowd, released Barabbas to them. He ordered Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip, then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to crucify him. You know, why did the Jewish leaders send Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor? The Romans had taken away the Jews' rights to inflict capital punishment, so in order for Jesus to be condemned to death, he had to be sentenced by a Roman leader. The Jewish leaders wanted Jesus executed on a cross, a method of death that they believed brought a curse from God, as Deuteronomy 21 and 23 would speak of. They hoped to persuade the people that Jesus was cursed, not blessed by God. You know, the Jewish leaders had to fabricate new accusations against Jesus when they brought him to Pilate. They couldn't just bring him under religious reasons. The charge of blasphemy would mean nothing to the Roman government, so they accused Jesus of 3 other crimes here, as if they haven't accused him of enough. They first accused him of encouraging the people to not pay their taxes to Rome. Secondly, they claimed he was a king, the king of the Jews. And thirdly, causing riots all over the countryside, tax evasion, treason, and terrorism. All these would be cause for Pilate's concern. So that's what they used against him. False accusations once again. You know, why didn't Jesus answer Pilate's first question? It would have been futile to answer, and the time had come to give his life to save the world anyways. Jesus had no reason to try to prolong the trial to save himself at this point. He knew what was coming, even though they didn't. His was the ultimate example of self-assurance and peace, which no ordinary criminal could have even felt or understood. He had a peace that the real criminal couldn't have had. Nothing would stop him from completing the work he had come to earth to do. As we look at Isaiah 53 and 7, it said, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before the shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth." He went right on with the plan that God had. You know, Barabbas was arrested for his part in a rebellion against the Roman government, and although he had committed a murder, he may have been a hero among the Jews. They wanted him released, and it was their way to get Christ condemned and murdered, basically. They hated paying taxes, so why would they go to the Roman authorities unless it was for their benefit? You know, this mob was most likely a group of people loyal to the Jewish leaders, but where were the disciples and the crowds who days earlier had shouted, "Praise God in heaven"? Where was that crowd now? Jesus' sympathizers were afraid of the Jewish leaders, so they went into hiding, basically. Everybody fled and left him alone. You know, the Jews hated Pilate, but they went to him for the favor of condemning Jesus to crucifixion. Pilate could see that this was a frame-up. Why else would these people who hated him and the Roman Empire he represented ask him to convict one of their fellow Jews of treason? Why would they come to him? You know, all of this just goes to show what people will do. You never know till you're in a situation what you will do, how far you will go, just to take care of your own self and what you feel you want or what you feel is right. As we read the account of Jesus' trial, arrest and trial and crucifixion, there seems to be no end to the suffering, both physical and spiritual, that he went through for us. As a result of this, we see there is also no end to his love for us. He forgave Peter, as he willingly submitted to the Father's plan for our redemption. Each of us can shape our own commitment to God by using this example Jesus has given us through this lesson today. And I'm going to close there. And next week, let's see, what is our lesson next week? Next week we speak about Jesus' death and resurrection. Thanks for being with us.